Hi there. I'm Victor. So I used to be at Google with Jeff, and some time ago, I think it's like 2 years ago and a bit, Jeff and I left the Angular team and co-founded Nrwl. So at Nrwl, we help companies in a couple of ways. One of them is we help them adopt some of the practices that are used at Google to do Angular right. We also help our clients modernize the enterprise. This is the thing that I like saying. Basically helping them introduce modern front-end dev tools into their workflows. Right? And that's what made me think about giving this talk. A lot has happened in the front-end space in the last couple of years. A lot of great tools like Apollo, GraphQL, Cypress, Jest, Prettier, NestJS have gained a lot of popularity. And I'm a very difficult person. I like to say the word nuanced, so I would be the last person to say that Cypress is always better than Protractor, or Apollo is always better than Rest, or stuff like that, right? There are trade-offs, so you need to look at those tools, evaluate them. But in many situations, for many projects, these innovative tools are actually great. They offer a lot of advantages. And the problem right now is that adding these tools to our dev workflows is a bit challenging, right? It's usually done in a very ad hoc way with a bunch of NPM scripts no one really maintains. So it doesn't really work. It kind of sort of works, but not really. So the experience you get is not ideal. So the choice you have is not between, say, Cypress or Protractor, but between a beautiful, like, no setup experience with Protractor just works out of the box, and kind of ad hoc setup with Cypress, it doesn't really work, right? So as we were helping our clients to use some of these tools, we sort of baked them into NX, which is a toolkit Jeff was talking about, to make sure everyone in the Angular community can try them and use them in your companies, right? So our hope is that with NX, the choices you're going to have are, like, you can use a beautiful, no setup, like out-of-the-box experience with Protractor, or just as beautiful, equally beautiful, maybe even more beautiful, out-of-the-box experience with Cypress, right? These are the choices. So you can evaluate the tools without worrying about the costs of switching to a new tool. I usually don't do live demos, but today it's one giant live demo, right? So brace yourself. And one caveat is that for some reason, I don't know why, because I'm unlucky, every time I present, my computer is very slow. So if you see things being somewhat slow, just imagine them being slightly faster, right, in real life, or like 2-3 times faster, right? Just accept it, right? Yeah, I know it sucks, but what can you do? Such is life, right? So I'm going to use 2 tools today to demo my stuff, right? And I became a really bad typist when I present as well. If I turn off the presentation, wow, super fast, always correct, right? So again, just imagine my typing correctly, right? So I'm going to use Nrwl NX, which is, can you see it, or is it too small? Let me bump it up a bit. Which is our extension for the CLI. For Angular CLI, again, this is not a replacement for the CLI. This is just this CLI plus some schematics and builders. It's CLI sprinkled with magic. And we are also going to use Angular console, which is the UI for the CLI, right? Sometimes using the UI is better than typing a command, and I will show you why. You don't have to, some people are insecure about using the UI. They're like, I'm a professional. I can just type in a command. Of course you can, right? That's fine, right? But you can also sometimes use a graphical tool to derive more value, right? We recently, like this week, actually launched a VS Code plugin for Angular console. So if you use VS Code, just use the plugin. We had a desktop app as well, but the plugin is a lot better. OK. So if I want to create a new NX workspace, right, I would run something like this. And I don't want, that's what I normally do with Angular CLI. I just need to provision a collection. Nrwl schematics over here, right? I can also do it in Angular console. If I go over here, I can click on this plus button, select a bunch of things, right, and create a new NX workspace. Because it's Wi-Fi, the conference, and Angular CLI is like this size, OK, in terms of node modules. I already did it, OK? But it's an empty project. There is nothing special about this project. I didn't include some hacks or anything that works on my machine but won't work on yours. It's just an empty NX workspace, an empty CLI project. Right? There are 2 folders in here, apps and libs, where you put the code. But if you run those commands, you're going to get that. Right? I'm just saving you 10 minutes of staring at me doing nothing. OK. So let's start. So I want to build a small app to show all these tools in action with Angular CLI. And my app is going to have the front-end piece and the back-end piece, right? Because we need to have a back-end usually to get the data that our app is going to use. And I'm going to put the back-end next to my Angular application in the CLI workspace. So the same workspace is going to have a back-end and a front-end. And there are many advantages to doing that, right? First, you can share code, share libraries. You can refactor things to get the backend and the front-end to make sure that API is always aligned. It makes development simpler. It's basically a good thing, right? You can, if you go to our blog, you'll find some notes. I have some notes over here to make sure I cover everything. You'll find a lot of articles talking about why it's a good idea to collocate them. You don't have to do it. If you're a strong believer in having small repos, if you didn't understand the truth, that's fine, right? So let's create the backend. So I'm going to go into Angular console here, click on generate code, and I'm going to type in node application because I want to create node application. Okay. Can you see it? Is it big enough? Okay, wonderful. I'm going to call it backend because I'm not very funny when it comes to naming things. And by default, we can see here the preview of what the generator is going to create. Nothing has been done yet. It's just a preview of what it's going to do, right? By default, it's using Express to create my backend. Express is fine, but we can be better than that, right? So we're going to select Nest from this dropdown. And if I do this, right, and I look at the preview again, I can see there is more stuff that's being generated. And I'm going to walk you through that stuff, right? I look at it with my eyes, and I can see, that's about right. And I click on the generate button, right? Once it's done generating, I feel good about myself. I close this. I feel productive, right? Because stuff has been created. I can open this app.module. This is the backend, right? No, it looks, if I open this backend, if you have never seen Nest, you're like, are you sure this is backend, Victor? Because it looks very Angular-like. And it's a good question. Good question, Jeff. Yeah, good question, Jeff. It is. And that's one of the reasons why people like NestJS in the Angular community is that it is conceptually close to Angular, right? It feels familiar, which is a good thing. It has dependency injection. The configuration looks kind of similar, right? Same patterns and best practices apply. If you're building front and the back end, you can use the same mental models to structure your code to architect stuff, right? Which is a good thing. Secondly, NestJS offers a bit more structure than, say, a very minimalistic framework like Express. So it helps you to make sure that your application has a well-defined life cycle, that things work in a somewhat predictable way, that side effects are done in a way that you can reason through them and test them, right? I'm yet to see an Express application that is like that, okay? Because it's so easy to take shortcuts there. It's like everyone does it, myself included. Okay, so I'm going to build a to-do app because I'm short on time and it's the easiest thing I can imagine, right? So I'm going to steal some stuff because, again, I'm short on time. And once, as I mentioned, I'm a really poor typist when I'm being watched. I'm like a cattle in this way. So I just changed my service a little bit to return a list of to-dos instead of returning a string, right? Nothing interesting here. I can open the controller that implements my REST endpoint, right, for my backend. And I can update it and say, that's fine, right? But I want to actually return the to-dos over here. Let's change this guy to do. And I'm going to import it. OK, that's everything I need to do, right? So with this controller and that service in place, I have a simple endpoint and can serve to-dos. How do I serve this backend application? How do I know it works, right? If I were to build it myself, I would have like an ad hoc script I wrote 10 years ago. Probably like 10 years ago, nothing was available. 10 months ago, right? And I wouldn't remember how it works. It's not maintained. It's basically garbage, right? But thankfully, I use NX and Angular, in the console, so I can explore. I can go into Tasks tab, find my backend app, and see what I can do with it, right? And I can build it, lint it, serve it, and test it. As you can see, it's very similar to an Angular app. But in this case, we aren't actually building Angular stuff. This is backend. So if I run serve over here, and in what seems like forever with my slow computer, it's going to kick in. It's going to start serving my app. Let's take a look. Let's go to 1.2 browser, Firefox. Refresh it. And I mean, I can see it works. Oh, fantastic, right? Our simplest possible RESTful endpoint works. That's fine, right? That's not too bad. But I don't actually want to use REST. because I'm cool, somewhat cool. So I want to use Apollo and GraphQL because I feel like Apollo is the right tool for the job here. Just because. Oh, one thing I want to mention before I go into Apollo. There are specs over here, and I ran those using Jest. This is important for the future. Remember that. Okay, so I want to use Apollo. So how do I change this endpoint from REST to GraphQL, right? Well, it's not that hard, right? I'm going to create a new file called todos GraphQL. And if you have never seen GraphQL, just accept it. It's going to be look a little bit confusing. That's fine, right? Yeah, it's kind of hard to get it right, if you have never seen it. But it's actually fantastic tool, and I'm going to cover why you should, sell your car instead of using GraphQL and stuff. If I do queries, to-dos, I have to-do over here, right? This is the description of my endpoint. You can sort of intuitively guess it. Even if you have never seen GraphQL, you know that I have a query called to-dos that gives me an array of to-dos, and every to-do has an ID and a title. So next, what I want to do is create a resolver, and the resolver essentially is like kind of like a recipe telling me how this query should be implemented. Right now, I have an abstract definition of the query, but I need to know what to do when someone is asking for the query. So I'm going to create a to-dos resolver. Oh, God, I'm going to be over time, so hard. OK. I'm going to create app service over here, inject app service. Note that I'm using dependency injection, the way I would do it in Angular. Very handy thing, right? We're used to it in the Angular space. It's nice to use the same kind of thing in the backend as well, right? I'm going to get to-dos, and I just need to add a few annotations, or decorators, rather. Resolver, query, to make sure it knows what's going on. Resolver, query. And I'm going to, now having this resolver, I just need to register it in my module. This is my backend, remember, backend, not frontend. I'm going to add the to-dos resolver. Notice how similar it is. I have a list of providers. It feels familiar. It gives you worms. If I go to GraphQL module and configure it, again, in a way that is very reminiscent of what we would do in Angular. I'm going to just throw this guy in here. So what I'm doing here is quite straightforward. Basically, I'm telling the GraphQL module, find all GraphQL files in my project, get all of them, fantastic, and create like an endpoint out of them. And then it's going to use the resolvers to resolve certain parts of the endpoint, right? So I have it working now. Let's see if it actually works, right? If I go to my browser and I punch in GraphQL, I can see something popping up. This is DevTools for GraphQL that allows me to query my endpoint. If I do this, I can see it autocompletes, right? And I can get to-dos with a title, and I should get the same stuff in here. OK, cool, it works. So let's see why it is cool. Because like the endpoint is so small. It may not be obvious why would you want to do that instead of a RESTful endpoint, right? Because it's just so simple. It seems like it's overkill, and it is overkill for this type of endpoint, right? But the more complex your endpoint gets, the more advantageous using GraphQL and Apollo becomes, right? Because tooling is excellent. This is just one example of the tooling. Auto-completion, error highlighting, things like that works wonderfully. Performance of GraphQL endpoints tends to be a bit better because of the way they work. We don't want to go into that. It's easier to implement certain complex interactions like optimistic updates correctly. Optimistic updates are actually hard to get right. With GraphQL, it's relatively easy, right? So it doesn't work for everyone, because it requires you to change the way you think about your endpoints. It requires you to change the way your backend works, right? But if it works for you, it's fantastic, right? Check it out. One small note that the Angular console plugin you see actually uses GraphQL and Apollo right behind the scenes. All right, cool. We have our backend. The backend is excellent. We really like it. Now we need to build a front end. Let's do it. Let's fire Angular console. And let's note my backend is still running, right? I didn't kill it or anything. So if I find an application, run. If I find an application, I can generate an Angular application next to my backend. So they're going to be side by side. And again, I'm not creative. I'm going to call it front end. As you can see, we have something. That's fine. So by default, the application is going to generate will be exactly the same what you would get in the CLI. Same layout, same files, like minor exceptions, but basically the same stuff. And it's going to use Karma to run your unit test, and it's going to use Protractor to run your end-to-end tests. As I mentioned, we use Jest on the backend. we would like to use Jest on the front end as well. So it's the same tool we use to test everything, right? Because it works, it's super fast. Why wouldn't we, right? And that's true. So let's just change to Jest because, again, we're young and hip and stuff like that. And next, Protractor is fine, but I really, really like Cypress, right? So how can I use it? I can use it by just changing it from Protractor to Cypress. That's it. That's everything you need to do. And this is the command you see. You can run it in the terminal, right? You just go generate, and you just pass, I want Jest, I want Cypress, that's it, right? And as you can see in this preview, we have Cypress over here, and we have Jest somewhere over here, yeah? So it looks good. It looks like what we want. Let's click on generate. And we have it working now. So let's take a look. The front end, this is our front end, and this is our end-to-end tests. And you can see we're using Cypress, and we have a spec over there, right? Let me bump it up so you can see. So the Cypress setup over here. I will show you how it works in a second. First, let's look at unit tests, right? So these are unit tests for our component. They look exactly as what you would normally see, right? They don't change, that's fine. But when we run ngTest front end, we're going to use Jest instead of, or the CLI is going to use Jest instead of Karma, right? Without you having to do anything. You don't need to think about it. You can have multiple projects. Some of them use Jest, some of them use Karma. Fine, right? You don't have to, the developers don't have to even know, right? The CI doesn't have to know. So in here, if I run the test right now, just to prove you that that's the case, you can see that without any setup, I have the Jest stuff running, right? And Jest is quite good for a couple of reasons. A, it's fast. Every new tool claims to be fast, but Jest is actually fast. And let me see. And it's the same framework we tend to use on the backend, or many people tend to use on the backend as well. So it's nice to use like just one tool for everything, right? Nice uniformity there. And it has nice features like, snapshots, which again, I'm not going to cover in detail right now because that's not the point. But if I do this, as you can see, it would work, right? Okay, that's great. And snapshot would allow me to not have those giant nested objects on my specs, and instead, Jest is going to maintain those automatically for me and stores them on disk. Okay, cool. Before we go further, let me do one quick thing that you just need to ignore. Pretend this doesn't happen, just because I don't want to cover why this is required. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So now let's look at running end-to-end tests, because I think that's where the real magic is, right? If you know how difficult it is to write end-to-end tests with, like say, WebDriver, right? It is challenging. People hate it. It's a lot of effort to write. And there are advantages that WebDriver gives you, like you can run multiple browsers, stuff like that, right? But the amount of effort it takes to write an end-to-end test is immense, right? So let's see how hard it is to do it with Cypress. So I have this spec in my specs folder. Let's change it. And by default, it just checks that your application says, welcome to frontend, right? We don't want that. We actually want to check that it displays to-dos instead. So I'm going to change my end-to-end spec to do that. I'm going to say, go to root, then get all. I just will assume that all my to-dos are in LIs. In the real app, it's going to be some to-do component. Right now, I just don't want to bother with that, okay? So just imagine it being a bit more robust for the real app, but it's not going to be that much different, right? It's still a very similar idea. Inner text. Oh, shoot, inner text, some title. Whatever I had in my backend, right? So even if you don't know Cypress, you can sort of get what's going on, right? We're going to root. We're checking that there is an LI with a particular title. It's not groundbreaking. Once again, I can run end-to-end tests right now in using ngAtlanta, using the UI, but just to show you that it's exactly the same. Everything I showed you so far, you can run the UI or you can run the terminal. It's exactly the same. There is no special magic that the UI does, right? I'm going to just run it over here using ng end-to-end, front-end, end-to-end. And I'm going to run using the watch mode, right? So I can iterate. While running, you can sort of see that we're using the same commands that we would normally use with Protractor. Nothing has changed, right? But it's going to use a different tool under the hood, right? And there are a bunch of reasons to use Cypress, why people like it. Firstly, it is fast. Nothing on my laptop right now is fast. But if you imagine a setup which is like normal, right, it is faster, right? It is flexible. as it allows you to separate your backend from your front end, like basically shim or like mock your backend, right, in your end-to-end tests. So you can test your front end fully without depending on your backend. And finally, its tooling is superb, right? And the tooling is what I really love about it, right? So if I go to my spec right now and I wait for, it seems like forever. It's quite fast, actually. Fantastic. So I can see the test is failing. Why is it failing? Because we didn't let me zoom in. Because we didn't implement the app. There are no allies, there are no to-dos, right? It tells me, cannot find it, sorry. So let's implement our app, right? Let's actually show some to-dos in there, okay? So to do that, I'm going to change my front end. Let's go over here. As you probably remember, hopefully, if you don't remember, that's a problem, right? We're using GraphQL on the backend right now, right? So we're going to use GraphQL and Apollo on the client side to connect to our endpoint, right? So how do we do it? Since I'm sort of short on time, I'm going to just steal some code from my template, but it's boring code, so I'm going to walk you through it real quick. The only thing that matters here is this function. I just changed my app module on the Angular side, and this function creates an Apollo instance, right? I just tell the setup, give me an Apollo instance and use HTTP to connect to the backend and use an in-memory cache. Nothing fancy, right? If you look at the Apollo docs, you'll find something like that, okay? With this setup in place, we can finally implement our component, right? This is our component, the main component our application shows. So to make it work, I'm going to inject the Apollo instance over here. And in here, I'm going to say I need to watch query, GraphQL. And I'm just going to do to-dos, ID and title. I'm going to do a few things that I'm just going to walk you through in 1 second. Let me import a few things in here. So what's going on over here is I'm basically querying the backend. I use the same query I use in DevTools. That actually is the way I usually work with GraphQL. I play in DevTools till the query is exactly right. Copy it over. And I'm querying in my backend. I'm subscribing to all the changes in my backend. And then I'm extracting the data out, right? So there is an easier way to do it, right, where you don't have to type as much. But the way it's done over here, it will keep my list of to-dos up to date. So if I change something on the backend via a different tool, this query is going to get an updated list of to-dos. So my app will always display the correct set of to-dos. It will never be out of sync, right? But there is also a way to get rid of this any. Apollo allows you to generate services based on those queries, so your interaction with the backend is fully type safe. I don't want to go into that right now because it will take another 10 minutes. But it's not hard to do. So if you want to achieve full type safety, it's not hard at all. And here I'm just going to do what I of to-dos, I think. OK, this is the simplest front that we can imagine. We're just showing the title. And now if I go over here, just refresh, it's passing. OK, so a few things to note here. That the end-to-end test we're running while I was developing. So usually the way I do it, because Cypress is actually very fast. I write the end-to-end test first, I'll launch it, and then develop my feature where Cypress is rerunning tests all the time, right? Till I get closer and closer to my feature being done. And because it's like really visual, it actually gives me a lot of feedback. I don't have to surf and keep refreshing myself and see, is it there? Is it there? Like, it does it for me, right? And it's kind of hard to get it if you don't use it, right? Another thing that's really cool here that I can time travel. So I can step through my application. You probably can see right now, right? And I can sort of see what's going on, right? If I have a complex scenario, it's actually a beautiful thing to be able to go back and see what the hell has happened, right? Especially when tests don't work. This is a trivial test, right? It's very hard not to make it work, right? But a more advanced with like animations, running around and stuff, having stuff like that is an asset. Finally, if I click on this guy, you can probably see that I can get all the responses from a backend. All my client-side interactions are available here as well, right? So I don't need to inspect the network and try to find the right request at that time, try to correlate it to what I think might be happening, right? It's right there, right? It's very hard not to understand what the hell your application is doing, right? It's not impossible, but it is hard, okay? Okay, I have 30 seconds, so I will be super quick. Okay, cool. So what did we do today? We did a bunch of things. First of all, we integrated NestJS or used NestJS to build our backend. NestJS is a fast-growing Node.js framework. It's very nice for a couple of reasons. One of them is that its values is like sort of aligned with Angular. same best practice apply, same terminology. It's very easy to use if you're an Angular developer. It also gives you more structure, so it's easier to build maintainable apps, especially if you have a larger team. I will use the Poland GraphQL. For example, you don't see why it's needed. You're probably very unhappy about it because it's more code. But for anything non-trivial, it's a wonderful tool. The performance, the tooling, the maintainability is just amazing. Right? The payoff is huge. Highly recommend to check it out. I will use Jest. It's fast, same framework on the back and the client side. I like it. I use it for everything. I no longer use Karma. We use Cypress. Again, it's fast. And the tooling that the Cypress gives you is superb. The interactivity I showed you, it's kind of hard to appreciate if you didn't do it yourself. But if you spend like a week using it, you would appreciate it a lot more. Another thing that I didn't show, but NX adds Prettier support to Angular CLI. So everything we generate is formatted with Prettier. It's all prettified. So your code formatting is consistent as well, right? And we got it without having to learn new commands to do any of the stuff. Like build, test, serve, lint, end-to-end, work in exactly the same way. Source maps work, debugging works. The editor experience works. All the types are actually provisioned correctly, which is not trivial, right? It's not that easy to get everything right. All your CLI commands you would normally do to introspect how it's going on will work in the same way, because we are not hacking the CLI. We're just extending the CLI using the extension points the CLI team gave us. That's why the CLI is so fantastic, right? ngAtlanta, the UI for the Angular CLI, works as well. OK, cool. If you want to learn more about us, about me, about Jeff, go to Nrwl.io and blog.nrwl.io, where you can find high-quality Angular content. We have a booth. We're sponsoring the event. Booth over there, so talk to us. Talk to Jeff at least. Check out Angular console, the UI for the CLI, especially the VS Code plugin. It is quite good, right? Don't be afraid that someone will think you're not a real professional because you're clicking on a button. UI is good, right? Sometimes UI is better than no UI. And finally, check out NX. NX is extensions for the CLI that sort of made all of this stuff trivial, right? Everything works out of the box, right? Everything I showed you, which is a property we as developers don't appreciate. Right? We're like, I can make it work. It's like, yeah, I mean, sure. You probably won't spend enough time to make it work so it's completely seamless. And finally, if you are in the States or Canada, and you like to work remotely, and you want to work on cool projects, and in this case, you like to wear cool glasses, please reach out, right? Because we constantly hiring. Thanks so much.
OK, Ryan, I got one. What kind of treat do whales like?
Ooh. I always want to be clever, but I can't think of it.
Blubber gum.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Oh, come on,
I'll be here all day. Yeah, go ahead and boo. It's OK. You know what was really cool is that Natasha yesterday from Greater Sum and Brad from Google, they both mentioned Angular Console. And those are two companies that don't make Angular Console. Nrwl actually makes it. So again, we're not deep in like the Angular technical stuff, but it must be really cool if two different speakers mentioned it already.
And it's super impressive, too, how easy it is to just set up
Am I
things
supposed
like
to jump
that.
in?
Yeah, come on
I mean,
up.
you could stand there.
Or you can hide away
awkward.
from us, too. But yeah,
I'm not sure what the protocol is.
You're so polite. Where are you from again?
I'm from Canada now, but originally I'm from Russia. So it's actually, despite my Russianness, I'm so polite, I'd say.
The Canadians felt like...
Yeah, the Canadian side won over some time ago.
The most polite person we've had up here all day so far.
Right.
Like, including Ryan, who is Canadian.
Yeah. I think the Americans rubbed off on me. I've lived in the US for a bit, so...
Yeah, it's true. When we were driving back from the airport, he like flipped off 3 people. For no reason. Just like hand out the window. He's like, they don't know where I live.
No reason at all.
Yeah. I'll never see them again.
So, you've written books.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what's the last book you've read?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. The very last one, actually, I read on a plane, was the book The Hate You Give, which is a good book. I recommend checking it out. The one before was The Conlin of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and that's a good book. Check it out. I read a lot of books, so you can narrow it down to like I feel it now.
So if we need book recommendations, we should come to you.
Yeah, just ping me. I'm always happy to recommend books.
All right. And so, not a poutine fan.
No, actually, vegetarian poutine is just very sad.
Yeah,
okay? So that's just the reality.
You have to have the right gravy. And
yeah, exactly. Without the gravy, you have potatoes and mediocre cheese,
yeah.
right? So I love cheese, though, right? Just give me the cheese, ignore the potatoes. Right?
That's good. Squeaky cheese, it's always good.
I think that's so weird. Anybody ever had poutine out there?
Yeah, hands, show of hands. That's enough.
I thought it was like some of the strangest food I've ever had. It's like squeaky. Right. And Ryan's like, oh, that's a feature, not a bug. And I'm like, okay.
It is. You wanted it the squeakiest possible. That means it's fresh, it's delicious.
Right,
yeah.
That's bizarre to me.
There is something appealing about poutine. When I was not a little boy, younger, and I was still drinking, right? Poutine was a good addition to the drinking experience, right? Now when you're sober, you question yourself a lot more. When you eat poutine, like, what is this? Like, am I making the right choice? No, you're not making the right choice.
No, it is definitely a good drinking food.
Yeah.
So tell us, it sounded like you're working or just about done or completed a recent book. What are you writing about?
So Nitin, who works with us, he authored a really cool book on monorepos, and I helped him a little bit with editing and stuff. And it's a cool book because we talk about some of the ways Google builds software, right? Google obviously is a huge organization with many practices. So we cherry-picked a few of them, right, that I think apply to most organizations quite well. And so NX is sort of verification of those practices in software, right? Yeah. It helps you use those practices without hassle. And the book sort of talks about how to do it, right? So you understand the motivation, you understand what practices to apply, why would you do it. And we are planning to keep working on this book because I think it's a very important topic, right? For a lot of us right now in the front-end space, we finally got a lot of tooling that is excellent, right? So it took us some time, but now our editor experience is just as good compared to the backend and stuff like that, right? The rest of the tooling is fantastic, right? So our projects grow in size. So we need to understand how to use those tools effectively, right? To make sure that we can develop those giant projects we all develop.
Yeah, and I love the talk too, is just even watching you live code. It's right. And showing off the new tooling right. is this is how it works and how this is integrated. Right. I think it was a great way to demo that, it's so well.
Yeah, I think it was, so I don't remember, was it Anders Heisberg? Maybe it was him. When he said why it's so easy for him to present TypeScript. It's it just works, right? Yeah. So you don't have to try to massage the presentation, I'm not going to show that, right? When it just works, you don't even have to prepare. You just look, it's so simple, right? Yeah. It's sort of hard to get it wrong, right?
Well, you made it look easy, so.
Yeah, I think it's genuinely easy. So I highly recommend you check it out, especially the testing side of things, right? Because if you try to do it yourself and set it up yourself, it is possible. Everything is possible, right? But many people get discouraged, right, because of how hard it is.
Awesome. Well, it was an amazing talk. Thank you so much for coming on and hanging out with us on stage. You didn't run away from us, so that was good.
I was going to, but I'm
All right, well, thank you so much. And round of applause for Victor.